Hello, and welcome to the Cloud Security Alliance's webinar series, CSA Cloud Bytes, where we explore the latest advancements and challenges in cloud computing. Today's webinar, sponsored by Sonrai Security, is titled Least Privilege Reality Check, Redefining Cloud Access and Permissions, and we are joined by Jeff Moncrief, Field CTO, Sonrai Security. Just a few quick announcements before we begin. Please be aware that slides from this webinar will not be provided. However, a recording of today's session will be available shortly after its conclusion. Before you leave the webinar, please take a moment to fill out a brief survey located at the bottom of your screen. Your feedback is valuable to us and will help us improve future webinars. Now I will pass it off to Jeff to get us started.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So before we get into the primary presentation here today, I want to thank you all for joining and give you a quick introduction. My name is Jeff Moncrief. I am the field CTO over here at Sonrai Security. I have been in InfoSec for over 20 years now, focusing just on public cloud security for the last 8 years, specifically just identity security the last 4 years since coming over here to Sonrai, which is the world that I have lived in day in and day out ever since. So the world of least privilege, privileged escalation, excessive permissions, and all of those crazy things like lateral movement scenarios through the identity fabric. That's really all I do day to day. So hopefully some of the lessons learned that I've gained over the years will kind of translate in this presentation. And really the idea is that I would love for everyone to walk away with a few nuggets to hopefully enhance an existing strategy as it relates to securing the public cloud across the platform, or perhaps help you to start a strategy, because that's one thing I've learned is that there has to be a strategy to attack this significant risk surface that we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to get into it. So this session is really designed to help folks understand that not all permissions are created equal, but that there is a method to the madness here. It does involve a lot of work. I'm going to go ahead and set the stage there, but we're going to talk about how to actually start to attack the permissions surface and the risk associated with it. So we're going to go through what defines a sensitive permissions. Not all permissions are created equal, as we're going to be discussing. Some are fairly benign in the public cloud, whereas some are very, very dangerous as it relates to either intentional via bad actor or unintentional risk being created by leveraging these different permissions across the 3 different primary cloud service providers. Current challenges, right? So it's not easy to implement least privilege. It involves a lot of time, a lot of work, a lot of research, and a lot of policy writing that we're going to. Also, how to build a least privilege structure and strategy today with cloud native tools. There are some cloud native tools that we can start to leverage and utilize to help us at least get started with tackling this risk landscape. And then we're going to double down on risky permissions or sensitive permissions. And we're going to go through 4 or 5 different permissions so that you can, understand tangibly what we're talking about here when we're talking about not all permissions are the same as others in the public cloud. And then we're going to talk about what you can do to actually start to put the pieces of the puzzle together to build a strategy to implement least privilege in your cloud, whether by doing it by hand or hopefully as you start to mature this strategy, start to leverage tools that will help with the automation of a lot of this legwork for you. So let's jump into it. All right, so the first thing that we want to do is we want to set the stage with both service usage as well as sensitive versus non-sensitive permissions. The very first thing that we want to talk about is the permissions landscape as it exists out there today in a default public cloud environment. It doesn't matter if it's AWS, Azure, or GCP. It's all available. It's all turned on to be used. And that's something that I did not understand when I first started securing the public cloud, was that it's all on and available for usage, whether that's something like, Azure Functions, things like RDS or Lambdas or EC2, all those different services are on, right? But what we have learned over many, many years now here at Sonrai and myself personally with working on hundreds and hundreds of customers is that the majority of those services aren't used. So if you think about that, that's a huge part of the permissions attack surface that's out there ripe for exploitation that is not being used whatsoever. So we have to start thinking about, why does that exist? And should we allow that to exist? And is there a way to quickly remove it, right? So be thinking about that. The vast majority of the services that are permissioned through the access fabric, through IAM and identity, right? They're not even used. Okay, so that's the first issue. Now, when you look at the cloud service providers, there's over 40,000 different permissions across the three usual suspects, AWS, Azure, and GCP. But of those 40,000 plus, there's only about 2,500 that can actually do something damaging to your cloud today, to your company, and to your business, that can create new ingress and egress points, either at the platform or through the infrastructure itself. Be thinking about that kind of logic. Can this actually create an opportunity for an adversary to do real harm and damage to the business all the way up into the point of deleting my cloud? Or is it just a benign permission like a get or a list or a describe that maybe in the most sensitive of zones matters, but in the majority of the cloud accounts that you have out there is not that big a deal, right? When you boil it down to 2,500 versus 40,000, it starts to become something that's much more manageable from building a strategy to secure. Now, what's a sensitive permission, right? A sensitive permission, again, is something that can be, that could create an opportunity for an adversary to have a brand new unauthenticated route directly into your cloud. It can be something like creating pre-signed URLs, unauthenticated URLs, something that manipulates access keys, something that deletes resources, modify, updates, creates and deletes, those kinds of things. Again, things that actually are able to create things that an adversary can use or delete things that could cause harm to the business. That's a sensitive permission, right? Something that really, really would keep us up at night. Now, at Sonrai, on average, we see around 11,000, 12,000 identities in a customer's cloud environment. These can be person as well as non-person identities. Non-person identities often outnumber person identities 10 to 1, and they are equally, if not more dangerous, because they're more abstract, right? You're not thinking of them as at the forefront of your mind like you might be securing person identities, but we have to be thinking about all of them, right? Of those 11,000, 12,000 on average, right, what we see is that more than half of them have access to these sensitive permissions. So think about that. Do you really need 5,900 identities that have access to create NAT gateways, to create internet gateways, to manipulate security group ACLs, NSG group ACLs, those kinds of things? Create configurations inside VPCs? No, you don't, right? But those excessive entitlements and those excessive permissions exist because developers did not have the time to figure out a true least privilege policy for that particular identity, right? Now, when you focus on the sensitive permissions, right, only 8% of those on average are used, which is less than 500 of those 11,000 identities. So that's significant. 11,000 total identities, 5,900 had access to use the permissions, but really only about 500 do anything with that classification of sensitive permissions that you've made, okay? And on top of that, they don't use them every day. They may use them once a month, once every 3 months, once every 6 months. How often are you having to create infrastructure with ingress, egress points and those kinds of things? If you think about it, it's not all the time. It's on an as-needed basis, right? So it's all about boiling down the scope of what we really, really should be focusing on instead of playing whack-a-mole with having no idea which permissions we really need to attack to make a real dent in protecting the business out of the gate, right? So what this all really is referring to is what we call and what I call the unused permissions attack surface. The vast majority of services, regions, identities, and permissions that are out there living and breathing with permissions and entitlements and are enabled are not used. That's the truth. The data shows that over and over and over again, that the surface that's out there is significant, but the vast majority of it is not used. And that's what we have to be thinking about, is reducing the unused components of the public cloud. The first thing that we do is we want to talk about restricting use of those sensitive permissions that can do damage. So there's a very small part of the cloud that's living, right? We call it the running cloud. That part of your cloud, right, you have all these identities that are doing things, But again, a fraction of those need access to those sensitive permissions. So we need to be thinking about removing access to those sensitive permissions on the identities that we know that we need. The next thing that we need to do is we need to take care of those unused identities. I've said this for years, right? Cyber litter and cyber garbage are the biggest risk to any organization at any point in time, because that is all of those orphaned artifacts that are out there from projects past, teams past, and folks that are just no longer with the organization that you have to figure out, can I safely delete these 100 or 1,000 person or non-person identities that are out there in the cloud? Service accounts, roles, service principals, IAM users, those kinds of things. Folks, it doesn't matter what kind of analytics you apply. It doesn't matter if you have a tool that's saying that this hasn't been used in 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. What we have seen over and over again is that folks are so scared to delete those identities, right? So you have to be thinking about a way, can I actually remove that risk for the time being without deleting them? Because then you can remove risk without breaking things. And that kind of changes the game when you start looking at taking care of unused identities in a way that's not just deleting them. All right. Then regions and services. This is huge. This is a massive part of the attack surface. Unused regions that are available for you to deploy things into, as well as unused services that you can create brand new ingress, egress points, or do data exfiltration or any of those kind of kill chain based scenarios in, but the company doesn't use them. So why not just turn them off? Why not just turn off those regions and turn off those services? They're all controlled. Access is controlled to and from them through the identity fabric, right? So it's all IAM based, but they're not needed. So it's easier said than done, but that's something else that you have to be thinking about as it relates to a comprehensive strategy to securing the permissions fabric, right? You disable unused services, regions, identities, and what you're left with is your running cloud, and then you get those to a layer of least privilege that's reasonable, that's feasible, and that's manageable by just taking care of sensitive permissions. Okay, so first thing that you need to do, right, to building a strategy, start to implement a plan like this, is you have to enable logging, right? You have to turn on logging in all the environments that you want to start to think about building a strategy, because you've got to start to figure out what's used and what's not used. Okay, so that's the first thing, whether that's Stackdriver logs, Azure activity logs, or things like CloudTrail, you've got to make sure that logging is on so that you have a baseline to start with, okay? And then you have to start to figure out who owns what. Again, this is not an easy strategy that we're talking about in this session, but it's one that we must be thinking about, right? And that is, you've got to figure out who owns what. It doesn't matter if it's, development teams, if it's engineering teams, if it's cybersecurity teams and their testing environments. If you don't know who put it out there to begin with, you're going to have a very, very difficult time figuring out whether or not you can safely start to implement some of these restrictions and these controls. And it is a very manual process. I'm not going to kid you. And then you can start to turn on native tools, right? So AWS does have IAM Access Analyzer, right? You can start to take a look at that data and start to build SCPs, service control policies. Service control policies are going to allow you in AWS to control pretty much everything that I just talked about, but it is a very manual process that takes a lot of time. Same thing in GCP, it's going to have its policy analyzer, and then Azure is going to have Entra-PIM to help you both understand used and unused identities, as well as implementing some least privilege, what I would call from a stopgap kind of mentality, right? Run these tools for at least 30 days to start to get an idea of what this landscape looks like. I would not recommend deleting anything in any capacity for at least 90 days, to be honest with you, just based on my experience, to be safe. But you've got to start to have that level of visibility by turning on these tools to help influence and steer your strategy. Once you have that data, then you can start to build policies, right? So you can start to figure out which identities are dormant, and then essentially you can quarantine them, right? It is a manual process using native tooling. There are ways that we can automate this. That's not the intent of this session, right? But there are some ways that we can do this at scale to make this process easy once you've adopted the strategy, right? The first thing is, again, you want to take those identities that are unused and quarantine them. How do you do that? You basically say it exists, but I'm not going to allow any of those permissions to be used. Yeah, you might break something temporarily, but you didn't delete that identity. If it's ever needed, you're able to then come back and undo the changes that you made, right? And grant it back those permissions. You're probably going to have to manage this in some sort of versioning system, some kind of spreadsheet. It is going to be some work there, but that is the first thing that we need to be thinking about. The second thing is you can take least privilege policies, right, and start to apply those to those different identities as it relates to sensitive permissions. You don't want to remove everything because you don't want to break them from functioning and doing the day-to-day, but you can start to reduce the permissions with resource policies and service control policies and those kinds of built-in native cloud controls to remove, not necessarily, again, all permissions and get it to true least privilege, because that's going to be a lot of work, but at least start to remove just the sensitive permissions that could do the company harm, right? Now, when we're talking about sensitive permissions, what are we talking about? We're talking about things, as I've said before, that can do real damage and harm to the business. From the lens of an adversary, we're talking about the kill chain. For years, I've been kind of aggravated and nagged as being, called kill chain Moncrief. That's because I always look at things through the lens of how someone can take advantage of you, not through the lens of I'm doing something because it's a checkbox and it just looks good to the executives and to the business. I'm trying to figure out how can we stop the attack path from playing out, right? And that's really what constitutes categorizing sensitive permissions as it relates to particularly the MITRE attack framework. Years ago, the Lockheed Martin kill chain model was translated over to cybersecurity. It became the cyber kill chain. Well, as that kind of mentality has matured, MITRE has come out with their attack framework that many, many practitioners are familiar with. So when you're starting to map those permissions, this is a great way to start to map them, right? Unless you're using automated tooling that's purpose built for this, risk landscape, you're going to have to map this to something like MITRE, initial access, persistent, etc. And if we dive into kind of what those sensitive permissions look like, I'm going to give you a couple of examples, like I mentioned at the beginning of this, right? So we'll kind of look at it from the phase and the attack chain playing out, left to right. If you look at initial access, that's the very beginning of a threat playing out. That's someone that is trying to establish a foothold in your environment, in your public cloud, in your AWS or Azure or GCP environment, right? This sensitive permission right here. This is AWS, a Lambda, right? Create function URL config as well as the update. Again, this is the create and the update permissions, not list and describe or get, okay? This particular permission will create a URL unauthenticated and attach it to a Lambda. What does that mean? It means that this lonely little Lambda that was self-contained inside the platform is now exposed out on the public internet. And it's unauthenticated. So someone can log right in and then begin to execute code, do things like SQL injection, okay? Which will then allow them to further entrench their footprint to then begin playing out the next phase of their attack. Now, this can be intentional. I could get access to a workload that gives me access to a permission or a role that has access to create this permission on a Lambda, and no one would ever know it. This also can be the result of developers playing around because they wanted easy access in to test something, and then they just left it. They forgot about it, right? What if you could instead compartmentalize that, remove that sensitive permission from those identities out of the gate, and then they can use them as needed, right? Ask for that permission back, right? Either manually or through automated means. But when they're in, then you have to worry about persistence, right? And this is another AWS example. I've got examples for other clouds as we move forward. But this particular KMS or key management service policy, put key policy, what does that do? Well, it allows you to put a policy on a key. What does that mean? Well, a policy on a key in KMS says who can do what to it and what can they do with it. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that I can essentially attach a key to a compromised identity. I can attach a key via that policy, maybe to a brand new identity that I created that no one knows about because I'm already in your cloud. Okay, but when I do that, that means that I can now grant myself whatever permissions are attached to that key. Maybe that key has IAM pass role, which means I can then use that key to create more permissions, if not more identities, to do whatever I want inside the cloud environment. That is a permission that should be under lock and key. That permission should not be granted to more than 5,000 of 10,000 identities based on our statistics, but often that's the case, right? That's scary. That's a permission that should be under lock and key. Same thing with replicate secret to regions permission. This is a great example of lateral movement privilege escalation, moving lateral through the identity fabric, not the network. It's the exact same scenario. I can go from role to role, from account to account through trust in those scenarios, just like I could a network. I can privilege escalate by assuming something else, giving myself more permissions from the prior scenario. But that then allows me to do things like replicate secret to regions, which says I can put the secret over in US West 1 or South America or Asia or Europe, which would then grant access to deploy services over there when the business has no awareness of it. Very sensitive permission, again, that should be under lock and key. Then we get to things like credential access, and this is an Azure scenario, Microsoft SQL, okay? TDE certificates, they do encryption and decryption of things like Microsoft SQL servers. Imagine if a credential gets exposed out in GitHub, and by the way, just this week I learned of a brand new data exposure for Dropbox and Dropbox Sign, and it's the same scenario as GitHub exposures, where these credential dumps that happen week in and week out, they're not stopping. Okay, folks can get access to a key, right, or a certificate or a credential, and then they could do something like decrypt SQL servers. And so this is, again, it's a permission that you should not have out there granted to a large, amount of identities, person or non-person identities. But at that point in time, they could decrypt the database, and then they could start to, examine it, determine if there's anything in there that they want. They could even start to think about ransoming if they wanted to re-encrypt, and then keep that key. Lots of possibilities there for an adversary. And then this one right here, defensive evasion. This is really simple. What if I want to cover my tracks? What if I just want to turn off logging? Okay. And do whatever I want to do and then turn it back on when I'm done, or just leave it off, right? You had no idea I was in there. If you've got tripwire set that are, scrubbing through CloudTrail and Azure Activity Logs or GCP logs, you're never going to see it, because I, as the adversary, I had this permission and I just turned it off. I'd made an exclusion, and you never knew that I was there. In no world does that make any sense. That is a super sensitive permission that would violate so many compliance requirements and audit requirements that organizations have. So you want to protect that, right? And then finally, the achievement of your objective or data exfiltration. This right here, this is a permission that allows you to actually expose the data migration service in AWS. It's called Create Instance Profile. It doesn't sound super scary, but it actually allows you to create network rules and direct connections out to the public internet on what will be databases and data that are being migrated from one environment to another. This can be something that, again, could be intentional or accidental from an employee that just wanted to do something from home. So we opened this up to a network ingress egress point that allowed him to do whatever he wanted to do. Again, probably wasn't authorized, but then he or she left it, right? And then obviously it could be used nefariously against you as well. So it's something that you would want to keep under lock and key. Now, hopefully everyone understands what I refer to now when I'm talking about sensitive permissions, and it's kind of some of the things that we need to start thinking about. But I also mentioned in the beginning that this is not going to be easy. All right. This is not a feel-good presentation. I'm sorry. It is just, this is the truth that we have to accept. Okay. And one of those truths is that this is going to take some time, but you cannot ignore it. You cannot stick your head in the sand anymore on this. Identity is not only the new perimeter that I know we've all been hearing for years. Identity is the new network. Everything lives and breathes in a cloud native world through the identity and access and permissions fabric. Period. And we must be thinking about it the same way that we would secure a network, with segmenting, with firewalling, with zoning, and with turning things off. And in the beginning, without proper tooling, this is going to be manual. And that's okay, right? We can get our start this way, but you have to prepare. This is going to take time. We worked with a customer. They secured 2,000 identities, got them to least privilege. It took them 10 months. All right. It took several full-time employees, but it's something that is achievable. The issue is that it takes time to research. You have to figure out who put this identity here? Where did it come from? Where did it originate? Why? Are they still using it? And then even if they're not still using it, we have to work with them to come up with a safe way to delete it or to mitigate it, to quarantine a zombie by creating a policy that would do something like that, or removing those sensitive permissions, because you want to make sure you're not going to break anything that team might need, next week or next month or something like that. Or even if you do, that you want to have that line of communications to where you can grant that permission back to that identity, right? So it's very, very time consuming, but it's necessary. It's not a nice to have. Like I said, it's a need to have. And, if you think about non-person identities versus human identities, I mentioned that they outnumber human identities often 10 times to 1, right? They also are equally as dangerous. So you have to be thinking of those and factoring those into your research and talking to the app teams and talking to the dev teams and building a strategy to start to analyze this so you can start to take a look at those, probably the most sensitive of zones. That's what I would say to start out with. The most sensitive of environments. You want to focus on prod, you want to focus where the crown jewels are, and work your way out from there, right? Make it something that you can actually tackle and be successful at, small chunks at a time, right? And then be thinking about how you can grant those permissions back. It's not going to be simple, as I said. There will be, some bumpiness. And then point in time lease privilege, right? So it's not just granting perpetual entitlements back. If you only need something available once a year, once every 6 months, make it a temporary entitlement grant back. Don't make it perpetual, because why do you need that risk out there for the other 5 months, right? Or for the other, 29, 30 days in the month. It's just a temporary entitlement until they can create that VPC. They can create that NAT rule, whatever it might be, right? But then you take it back because it's not needed from a risk perspective. Just be sitting out there ready and available to be leveraged. So to conclude this session, I hope that everyone picked up a couple of nuggets on how to reframe things, okay? On how to reframe how we look at least privilege, because so often I work with organizations, they're just like, we just want to turn everything on. We want full visibility into unused identities and unused permissions, but we have nowhere to start. We have no idea really where to start and how to start to take bites out of the elephant, so to speak, right? So we have to be thinking about boiling that massive 40,000 permissions pool down into the 2,500 that can do real damage to the business. We have to be thinking about ways to remove risk associated with unused identities in a way that is not always just delete them, right? We have to be thinking about quarantining, and we have to be thinking about unused services and unused regions, because the vast majority of the permissions risk that's out there that's going to do harm to you is unused. That is a fact, right? And there is a method to the madness with reducing that unused attack surface. The first thing that you can do, right, is privileged human identity management. This is where those privileged access management just-in-time tools come into place, because they can grant access to humans temporarily to go do that single permission they needed to do and then take it away. That's amazing, right? But again, non-human identities outnumber those human identities usually 10 to 1, if not more. And that's where you need things like a permissions firewall. This is a brand new category that's being introduced into the identity risk security market. And it's all about taking action swiftly, quickly, not just visibility until you have 10,000 problems that you need to go fix. It's actually a technology purpose built to reduce this attack surface quickly and safely in a matter of days, right? By just turning off regions and services, quarantining, automating a lot of the stuff that we've been talked about today, because it's designed to do this at scale. So again, you can crawl, walk, run. You can start to do this by hand, but I definitely recommend you taking a look at purpose-built automated tooling that's designed for this particular attack surface. And then you can double down on things like CIMs, Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management. That's where when you've reduced the unused attack surface, what you're left with is your running cloud. Now you can focus on the most sensitive environments, true least privileges, where you won't even allow things like get, enlist, and describe. You can put tripwires around your break glass accounts. You can be alerted if a zombie, wakes up or something like that. But ultimately, it's that second layer of really getting granular on governing the running cloud, focusing on things like lateral movement, privileged escalation, cross account trust, separation of duties violations, all these things that we talk about in Kim and we've been talking about for years. Great, right? But imagine going from like 10,000 problems to 200 problems when you reduce that unused attack surface that's causing noise and ambiguity right now with we don't know where to start. Okay? When you're left with your running cloud, it's much more manageable. I can assure you that. Right, and then ITDR, those tripwires. Like, should something arise, you get notified, you get alerted, something like that, to nefarious suspect activity. So that concludes the session today. I really, really appreciate everyone joining and listening in. I hope that you all picked up a nugget or two to help you with, maybe rethinking how you could secure this attack surface either by hand or considering automated tooling that's built really to do this for you. Again, thank you for your time. I appreciate it. And back over to you, moderator.
Thank you, Jeff, for presenting, and thank you to our participants for joining us today. If you have further questions or would like to continue the discussion, please contact us at events@cloudsecurityalliance.org. We value your feedback and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for attending today's webinar, and have a wonderful day.